push record. And today's slides. We're going to pick back up on page 34. If you want to loosely follow along, but the slides will kind of go along with it. And we're going to go through, actually through page 52. We'll have one little thing to finish up on Friday. So the last thing we really discussed in depth was the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention, where our founding fathers came up with a federal government that was made up of 3 branches. And the legislature was a big compromise in which Congress would favor the smaller states, the Senate would favor the larger states, or the House would favor the larger states, and the Senate would favor the smaller states. And these 2 houses make up what we call Congress. We would now have a president, and we would have a Supreme Court with several lower courts. Today there are 12 lower federal courts. What the separation of powers did was it not only helped to balance power so that one person or one group of people has the majority of the power, but it was also set up so that the 2 other branches, for example, the legislative and the judicial branch, these 2 can keep a check on the executive branch. And likewise, the executive branch and the judicial branch keeps a check on the legislative branch. For example, even though the Congress is what makes laws, the president and the executive branch can keep a check on that branch by vetoing laws that they pass. They can even propose laws, so that it's not just the Congress with all the influence. All right, so know that the Great Compromise was one of the major issues at the Constitutional Convention, and out of it came our 3 branches of government, which would separate powers and keep checks and balances on each other. Any question on that? Just think of, whenever you see checks and balances, think of the little insane rabbit on Secret Life of Pets telling TD, Tiny Dog, always keeping me in check. Surely you guys remember that part. All right, we're going to move to a second major compromise that took place at the Constitutional Convention, called the 3/5 Compromise. You'll find this in detail on page 34 and 35. And what I hope you all will see in this is that the current divide that we see right now in our country, even though nobody today in our country has ever been a slave, there still is a divide concerning slavery that is manifested in the protests that we're seeing right now, the movement of the Black Lives Matter, because they will usually try to tie it into slavery, even though, once again, nobody living today in America has ever been a slave of that type, because there is a very, very evil sex slave trade going on right now. There's been no chattel slavery since the end of slavery after the Civil War. But what this is going to illustrate is that our country basically was founded with already a division based on slavery. Slavery really has been, and always has been, part of the DNA of the makeup of our country. So in this Constitutional Convention, the southern states wanted their slaves to be counted as people so that their populations would be higher and they would get more representatives for the House. Remember, each state was going to get a certain number of representatives based on their population. The majority of slaves during the federal period, the revolutionary period, still, even at that time before the Civil War, 80 years later, the majority of slaves were still in the southern part of the nation. So the southern states, the delegates that represented them at the Constitutional Convention, wanted slaves to be counted as persons when it came to determining their representatives. But on the other hand, the southern states did not want their slaves to be counted as persons because it would have meant more taxation. Really kind of a bizarre contradiction there. You see, in the northern states, you had more factories and you had more industry. In the southern states, you had more agriculture. So the northern states had more industry, factories, textile mills, things like that. And the South was afraid that the North would tax the imports coming from Europe on the textile goods so that the American textile companies would do better. But a lot of people in the South depended upon the imports from Europe, and so they would have to pay more for the American goods from the North because the European goods were cheaper. Also, the North would probably put a taxation on exports of agricultural goods going to Europe. And as I said earlier, the South had more agriculture, so they were exporting more goods like cotton and tobacco And if there was a higher tax on exports, that would hurt them. So they did not want slaves to be counted as people for the purpose of taxes. So the North was exactly the opposite of this. Do not let the South count slaves as people so that they won't get more representatives. But do count the slaves as people in the South for the purposes of determining taxation. So remember, the southern states, this plays out throughout our country through the Civil War. They were more for small states and state governments having more power and authority. The northern states, more of their delegates were for a federal form of government. Exceptions would be James Madison from Virginia. Virginia being a southern state. So they came up with another compromise called the the 3/5 compromise. Is anybody familiar with this compromise? And if so, just share a little blurb about it. Don't be shy.
Okay, I guess. It basically counted like 3/5 of a slave as like a person, but not an entire person, only 3/5.
That's right. The 3/5 compromise, as you can see there, said that one slave will only count as 3/5 of a person. So basically, 5 slaves equaled 3 people. So if we were to say, for example, South Carolina, let's say they had 50,000 slaves. What's that? Go ahead. Oh. Say South Carolina had 50,000 slaves, they would only be able to register them as 30,000 for their population. So in that way, the compromise was the southern states still were able to count 60% of their slaves to determine how many representatives they got, but the northern states counted that 60% to make sure they didn't lose as much tax money from the South. Now, if you've never heard of this, which it is in the Constitution, it was repealed in one of the amendments. So this, of course, we don't have slavery anymore, but this was eventually repealed, and then eventually slavery was abolished after the Civil War. One of the things that, one of the compromises, for example, the northern states, the delegates there, they wanted to get rid of the slave trade with Africa. The southern states did not want to get rid of that. They depended very heavily upon slavery for their economy. So one of the compromises was the northern states, or the federal government, I should say, the federal government could not ban the slave trade for at least 20 years, which would be 1808. because the Constitution actually, even though it was written in 1787, it wasn't ratified until 1788, and that's when it went in effect. Or 1789. And so the new government could not do away with the slave trade until 1808. So you can read about that on those pages, but there will be questions dealing with the Constitutional Convention, and you will need to know, along with these plans up here, Virginia and New Jersey plans, so you need to know the two plans and the two compromises, the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. You'll need to know that information. But again, your test is open book, so you'll just want to make sure you know where that information is in your book. Any questions on the Three-Fifths Compromise? All right, so you'll see there in the bottom of page 35 that we are beginning a section on ratifying the Constitution. Ratifying means having the approval of enough delegates or enough states to put it into effect. So it was written in 1787. Now we want to basically get it passed as the new law of the land, to get it ratified. What had to happen? Well, according to the, remember that they originally called their meeting together to revise the Articles of Confederation. And a part of the terms was revise the articles, and then after you come up with a revision, all 13 states have to approve it. This is what Congress said. This is the Congress under the Articles. This is what they said had to happen in order for the Articles to be revised. You will recall that the first thing, or one of the first things that the convention did, was they said, forget revising the Articles. We're just going to throw them away completely and draft a whole new constitution, which they did. But then the delegates did another thing where they ignored the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Instead of requiring that all 13 states approve of the Constitution, they said 9 states, 9 out of 13, have to ratify the Constitution. And then when the 9th state does so, the Constitution will go into effect. If you'll look on page 39, should be 39 in your textbook, there should be a section that is boxed in that says political thinking and conflict. Fight over ratification of the Constitution. You can see there in the middle that it shows you when all 13 states ratified the Constitution. The first state to do so was Delaware. December 12th, 1787. So it was about roughly 3 months after the Constitution was written. The 9th state to ratify it was New Hampshire in June of 1788. So it was 1788 when the Constitution was finally ratified and went into effect. Shortly after that, Virginia ratified it as the 10th state, New York 1 month later. And then the last 2 states to hold out were North Carolina and Rhode Island, which I believe at that time they were both the smallest states. You can see that they both waited over a year after the Constitution had been ratified, with New Hampshire passing it. And the reason being was that, remember, there were Federalists and there were Anti-Federalists. The Federalists believed that a federal government that had a balance of power, a separation of powers, would be good. The Anti-Federalists still were scared of a federal government that had too much power and authority. But eventually, federalism won, and the Constitution was ratified. Although there were a couple of things that had to happen. The main thing was that North Carolina and Rhode Island, they said, and it might have been New York too, and Virginia, the last 4 states, 3 or 4 of the states said, we're going to ratify the Constitution, but there has to be a Bill of Rights that will be added to it. Remember, the original Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights, which would be a section that would protect individual rights from the federal government. So with that agreement, or with that condition, those states joined, and then Madison was one of the leaders of drafting the Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1791. So federalism is the form of government that we have. So we want to look at some slides now that go along with the information, starting on page 40. And it goes through page 49. And that is that federalism is dedicated to the core idea or the core principle of limited government. Limited government. The framers of the Constitution were very convinced that government power will pose a threat to individual liberty. Any government that the power of that government starts to grow and get out of control is a threat to the liberty of individual citizens. So that leads to the second principle of limited government. Governments, when they exercise their power, they must be restrained. Something must be there to keep a check on them from becoming too powerful and abusive. And then federalism is a concept that of limited government where the government power is divided or separated so that the power is curbed or diluted, that's a great word, to prevent it from abusing its power. The president in the executive branch cannot abuse their power because the powers have been divided, and there is the judicial branch and there's the legislative branch to curb it or keep it in check. So that's why our framers were so dedicated to federalism. Because even though in England you had a king and a parliament, the king could be a tyrant and use his power to abuse his subjects. And while Parliament could maybe, in theory, oppose the king, a lot of times they would submit to the king or they would work in conjunction with the king, and the citizens underneath them would suffer. That's what was happening with our American colonists. Parliament with King George was continually taxing the colonists. They were infringing upon their rights as Englishmen, and so that led to the Declaration of Independence and eventually the formation of a federalist government. So federalism is a system of government in which a written constitution divides the powers of government on a territorial basis between a central or national government and several regional governments, usually called states or provinces. So while there is a division of powers within the federal government, there is also a division of powers between the federal government and state governments. So you have a division of powers within the federal government, and you have a division of powers between the federal government and the state governments. And these two circle charts will help us to illustrate this. The founders set up a government in which there were granted powers and there were denied powers. So these circles are illustrative of, this circle here is the national or federal government. This circle here is the state government. Under our Constitution, both of these government levels would have powers that were only regulated or delegated to those bodies. For example, there were delegated powers that only the federal government could pass. For example, only the federal government could print money, paper money, and print coins. Before this, all of the states had their own money. After we moved to a federal government under a constitution, states could no longer issue their own money, only the federal government. So that was delegated to them. There were some powers that only state governments could engage in or exercise. There were powers that the national government was denied. There were powers that the states were denied. There were powers that both governments were denied. Specifically, federal government and state government cannot infringe upon the rights of individuals. Free speech is a right that every American enjoys. Likewise, as Oklahomans, we have the right to free speech. The government of Oklahoma cannot deny us of our right to free speech, nor can the federal government. That being said, both governments also had concurrent powers. That is, there was powers that both of them could exercise. For example, both the federal government and the state government, they can, sad faces put on, they can tax us. And they still do. In a few years, as you enter into the wonderful fellowship of adulthood, a privilege in that fellowship is paying your income taxes. Both state and federal income taxes. Some of you may have already got your first paycheck. Some of you will be getting that soon. And you might be like the old McDonald's commercial, where a young high school man gets his first job working for the Golden Arches, flipping burgers and frying fries. And that first paycheck finally arrives. And he opens up the envelope with excitement. And he looks at his paycheck. And he's got a big smile on his face. But then all of a sudden the smile fades. And you see maybe a little anger in his eyes. And he cries out, "Who's this guy FICA? And why does he keep taking my money?" FICA. I don't know what it stands for, but it's some kind of federal tax. And you'll see all these columns on your paycheck. FICA, whatever, whatever, state tax, whatever, whatever. That is a power that both the state and the federal government have to tax we poor little citizens. So this slide presentation I'm going to put up today. Make sure you read through the rest of these slides that explain all these powers: expressed, implied, inherent, 10th Amendment, denied, concurrent powers. They're all explained in the rest of these slides. I'm going to let you look through those so that we can jump into finish chapter 2 on Friday and get into chapter 3. And so we close today's class by saying this. Under our Constitution, it's a federal system that has a division of powers. National powers, state powers, and concurrent powers. Right here's the summary slide. But as the old 90s song says, I've got the power. Who's got the ultimate power when it comes to the division of powers in the federal government? And the answer is the federal government will sing the song, I've got the power. We've got one federal government. We've got 50 state governments. We have more than 87,000 local governments. That's like the Arcoma City Council, the Vian City Council, and the Howe City Government. I changed it up there on you, didn't I? And each little unit within the states follows along with the Constitution of the federal government, as well as the Constitution of Oklahoma or whatever state it's in. Local governments, by and large, exercise the state law. But the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. So you got your city and county ordinances, your state statutes, your state constitutions, acts of Congress and treaties, and then the Constitution is the highest law of the land. If there's ever a conflict between the higher one and the lower one, the higher one wins. So any questions on that? All right, I'll have these things posted by this afternoon, and we'll see you back Friday, regular time, with a Will Rogers Friday edition to jumpstart the class. Have a great day. We'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.
You too.
Any questions before I leave on any assignments?
I don't think
No.
so. Thank you.